Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. Of course, welcome those who join us on the heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests in-house, we would ask that courtesy that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And of course, for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. We're pleased to host this program today on international security in the 21st century, or investment security, excuse me. Hosting our program and moderating our panel will be Riley Walters, who is our research associate in Asia Economy and Technology in our Asian Studies Center here at Heritage. Riley?
Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. Again, my name is Riley Walters. I'm the research associate here for Asia Economy and Technology. Today we have a pretty interesting event, at least in my mind, pretty emerging topic, and probably the best panel you can find to talk about the topic, which is investment security. For many of you who follow the events around town, you're familiar with CFIUS. It's a budding term, especially more recently, with a number of legislations that have been introduced, including Senator Cornyn's bill, which he introduced just last Wednesday. We also had the president blocking of the first, President Trump blocking his first Chinese entity of Lattice Corporation early in September, which was also around the same time that the CFIUS committee through the Treasury Department published their annual report. So we'll cover a number of topics today, many of which include what are the current CFIUS proposals, what is the investment environment, and how the United States might actually foster greater investment from foreign entities in the United States. So first, let me introduce our panelists. We have Matt Goodman. Matt is the William E. Simon Chair in Political Economy and Senior Advisor for Asian Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The Simon Chair explores current issues in international economic policy with a focus on the Asia-Pacific region. Before joining CSIS in 2012, Matt was White House coordinator for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation and the East Asia Summit. He also served as Director for International Economics on the National Security Council staff, helping the president prepare for G20 and G8 summits. Prior to the White House, he was senior advisor to the Undersecretary for Economic, Energy, and Agriculture Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Next, we have Derek Scissors, who is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on the Chinese and Indian economies and the U.S. economic relations with Asia. He is concurrently chief economist of the China Beige Book. Derek is the author of the China Global Investment Tracker, and before joining AEI, he was a senior research fellow here in our Asia Studies Center and an adjunct professor of economics at the George Washington University. He also worked for London-based Intelligence Research Ltd., taught economics at Lingnan University in Hong Kong, and served as an action officer in international economics and energy for the U.S. Department of Defense. Finally, we have Nancy McLernan. She is president and CEO of the Organization for International Investment. With a strong background in economics, her advocacy efforts focus on educating legislators on the important role U.S. subsidiaries play in the American economy and policy issues that would make the U.S. a more competitive location for foreign direct investment and job creation. She has written a variety of articles on policies impacting global businesses that have been published in numerous national newspapers, and was recently recognized by the Hill newspaper as one of Washington's top lobbyists among associates. She also happens to be a graduate of my alma mater, George Mason University. So with that, we'll begin with Matt Goodman, who will give remarks for roughly 10 minutes, followed by Derek Scissors, followed by Nancy, which we will end with Q&A from the audience. Thank you.
Okay. Threw us for a loop since we're out of order here, but that's fine. Thanks, Riley. Delighted to be here at Heritage on a very cold day, but a hot topic. CFIUS is back, and I think this is a timely event to talk through why and this has arisen and where it's headed. So let's just start with one thing to cut to the chase here. We're talking about China, and really, as we talked about before, China should probably be in the title of this event. CFIUS, China's not mentioned in any of this legislation that's being proposed. Well, actually, in one piece of legislation about financial services, but not in the Cornyn bill. But everybody knows that's basically what we're talking about here. So let's just get that, clear the air by saying we're talking about China. And in that context, I would start by saying that if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, I think we'd be having a very similar conversation to the one we're having today. In fact, I think that Donald Trump has focused a lot on our trade issues with Asian countries, especially China. And there are issues, not necessarily the ones he's flagging, but there are issues in trade. But I actually think the investment story, to the extent it's a different part of the story, it was actually the one that was going to be a bigger story in this period anyway, really because of both sides of the equation. In China, U.S. companies are increasingly finding the environment there unfriendly, and that's for a lot of reasons. Some of it has to do with sort of natural forces. China's not growing as fast, and labor costs are going up, and so forth. But a lot of it is because of policy changes in China, tightening of regulation generally, use of new laws on cybersecurity, use of subsidies to national champions that are competing with American companies. So I think the environment over there is getting more hostile, and what that's done is I think that's fed the two concerns: one about our economic competitiveness and the sort of reciprocity of not having that access in the Chinese market as being as comfortable as it once was, and then national security concerns. And when you look at the inbound side of the story, which both Derek and Nancy, I'm sure, are going to talk about as well, you have a couple of things that are different about China. One is the size of China and the size of the flows that are coming from China, especially in just the very recent period, 2016. Again, Derek's going to probably go through these numbers, but essentially the stock of Chinese investment doubled in just the year 2016, effectively. So there's been a huge inflow from a very large economy. So that's sort of raised concerns of its own. And then there's the whole story about the nature of this Chinese investment, because China has set out a very explicit, to their credit, they're very transparent about their plans to become the dominant player in a series of advanced sectors, from AI to robotics to biotech to aviation to a bunch of other sectors. They have a plan, it's embedded in this Made in China 2025 plan. China is, a country where the state still has a dominant role in the economy. It's a country which is putting a lot of money and policy muscle, including things that you might broadly call unfair, but that's a loaded word, so let's just say problematic policies behind this plan. China is a strategic competitor. They're not an ally the way Japan is. But when this issue kind of first arose as a big issue when we were all cutting our teeth in the late 80s or early 90s, and Japanese investment was coming in, and we kind of went crazy in the first round of all of this. Actually, there was an earlier round in the 70s, right, when CFIUS was actually created. But really, it was the Japan thing that sort of where this all exploded and became a topic of conversation. But again, Japan wasn't all of the things that I just described. China is. It wasn't as big. It wasn't a strategic competitor. It wasn't a sort of party and state-dominated country that was putting lots of muscle and money behind this sort of ambitious plan. So, and then obviously there are changes in our economy as well, because it was one thing when a Japanese company was coming in and either setting up a greenfield investment or buying a sort of chunky thing like an oil company or a telecom company or something which you could sort of see and analyze. But obviously with a shift in our economy from more capital-intensive manufacturing toward more intellectual property-based activity, that makes this story more complicated because it's harder to see what's going on, and you're now dealing with the possibility of not buying one chunky thing, but the Chinese coming in and buying 1,000 garages. And they're not only buying those garages across the United States. By the way, they're not just buying the garage; they're buying the guy in the garage who's tinkering with something that someday may be problematic, either from an economic or a national security point of view. and they're buying garages in Canada and Germany and Japan and other countries as well. So for all those reasons, this story is more complicated, and therefore, I think, in my view, and I think I'm probably appropriately seated between these two folks, because I think there is a problem, and I think we do need to look at the CFIUS procedures. That is this committee that's been set up now for 40 years, but has really been doing what it's doing for the last, I guess, 30 of those, and 10 years ago was reformed again. But basically, I think I think it's a process that is broadly working in the sense that it has a lot of discretion. The agencies in that room have a fulsome debate about issues, but they have a lot of tools. They have a lot of discretion. And for the most part, I think they've used that effectively and appropriately to review the cases that have come through, and have done what is the important thing to me, and I think is the important thing to the new legislation that Cornyn has laid out, which is to maintain the critical balance between maintaining an open investment climate in the United States and protecting our national security. I think it's done a pretty good job over those years of maintaining that balance. And in fact, I think that that's the test of any new approach or new legislation. Are we really maintaining that balance? And here's where I think, again, I acknowledge the problem. I think the way that in the preamble to Cornyn's legislation, he lays out 7 points about the importance of an open investment climate, but the changes, the shifting national security landscape, the critical role of CFIUS and the need for more resources in CFIUS, and then the need for outreach to allies and partners to coordinate on all of this. All of those points I agree with. I just think it's important for us to meet the test in any new legislation, that we are both addressing the real national security challenges here that may be more challenging, mainly because they're harder to see, as I say. So we need, I think, better insight into transactions, but without discouraging the open investment climate that is not just a theoretical proposition or something that I'm sure the Heritage Foundation believes as a matter of principle. I actually think it's a practical thing, because remember, a lot of the foreign investment that's coming in is actually contributing not only growth and jobs, but to our technological prowess and to our capability to compete with countries like China, and to have a military that can compete with adversaries. So it's extremely important to maintain that balance. And so to me, that's the test. But I do think that it's appropriate to be thinking about giving CFIUS more resources, more analytical capacity, to be sharing information with allies. I think that's a very important part of this story, because obviously allies, first of all, have not had the same awareness about these issues until relatively recently. But the scales have dropped from their eyes in many cases in Germany, Japan, and other places. But they have, I think, information. We all have our compartmentalized information. I think it's very important to try to get together and share so that we can see what's going on. And I think, and I guess my final point, let me say 2 final points. One is, again, I think that whatever is done in new legislation should be based on establishing the principles of open investment and protection of national security, and then details to fall from that, but not be too prescriptive. I think one of the strengths of CFIUS has been that it's had a lot of discretion and flexibility, and the fact is it can unwind transactions after the fact if it misses something. So I think, in fact, I'll challenge Derek to tell me of a transaction that's gotten through that is problematic to date. I mean, I think it's got a pretty good track record, so we need to be careful there. That's one point. The final point is, this issue cannot be seen in isolation. I think at best, the CFIUS story is one of a 4-part story about how we rise to the challenge of China. And I'd say that this is, in a sense, the least of them. the least of these four pillars. It's protecting the crown jewels. We need to do that, okay? No question about that. So we need to find the right way to do that. The second thing we need to do is we need to brush China back when it does things that are problematic or unfair or whatever you want to call it. We need to use our trade remedies and tools and other tools to push them back and make sure that they are following the rules in letter and in spirit. Totally appropriate. So that conversation, I think, is appropriate as long as we do it ourselves in a way that's principled and, consistent with our international obligations. Those are the two defensive things we need to do. Then there are the two offensive things, which I think are much more important, which is we need a proactive economic strategy in the world and certainly in the Asia-Pacific region. And we can talk about this, but, the decision to withdraw from TPP, I think, was a blow to that strategy. CPP was not perfect, and we can talk again about that. But I think we need, if we're not going to pursue TPP, we need something like that. In fact, a lot of things like that push out market opening and rulemaking that suits us and incentivizes others to join us. So that's, I think, probably the most important pillar. Well, and then the fourth, which is the other really important one, which is we need to invest in ourselves. And that means everything from investing in infrastructure and education and training to investing in our economic prowess. And here's a controversial thing to say at Heritage, but I think we should even be talking about the possibility of industrial policy. I don't, that's a dirty word even to me, but let's face it, the Boeing company would not exist without industrial policy. You might not call it that, but that's why we've got a Boeing company. The internet famously wouldn't exist without DARPA. A lot of biotech business would not exist without NIH seeding some of this activity. And I think, with Japan, we built Semitech as a response to the semiconductor challenge, and it, has worked fairly well. We can debate that, but I do think if we're really going to take this issue seriously, I think that has to be part of the conversation as well. But the broader point there in that last bucket is we need to be thinking about what we ourselves are doing to get ourselves strong enough to compete with China. If we do all those things, then I think we can take on this challenge. And I wouldn't just focus on the defense and trying to keep out the bad stuff or the bad guys, because that's not going to be sufficient. That's it.
I was agreeing with Matt through most of that, and then he just had decided to go off the reservation and start talking about industrial policy and how the TPP is going to solve this problem, or would have. We do agree on the main topics, and I probably will stick to those, although I'm not the most disciplined speaker in the world. I used to say that 99% of foreign investment was good for the U.S., and that CFIUS was doing its job just fine. I would have said that as recently as 2 years ago. I think the 99 is probably now 95%, and CFIUS isn't really doing its job as well as it should. Even though its history is of, as Matt alluded to, I don't see major mistakes made by CFIUS. Maybe they're below the radar, but I don't see a bad track record, and I absolutely agree with the main point that open market advocates everywhere agree with, which is foreign investment is good for the United States. The trend in the last 2 years is for CFIUS to struggle more and more, and for us to be getting more investment from China, a little bit from other countries, but as Matt indicated, mostly from China, that isn't necessarily good for the United States. So disclosure, I've been working with Senator Cornyn's office since March of 2016 on this bill. It was much shorter back then. It's one way to make sure that the contribution from outside is really small. Like if you write 1 page of an 8-page bill, it seems like a lot, and if you write 1 page of a 79-page bill, it doesn't seem like anything. So I have a bias in favor of the bill, although I do not think it's at all perfect. The impetus, as Matt said, comes very clearly from surging Chinese investment, which starts in late 2015 and extends into most of 2016. And the numbers are, we have U.S. government numbers, which you should not use. The U.S. government does not know how to count Chinese companies. The biggest investment by China in the U.S. this year is HNA closing on CIT Group for $10.38 billion. It was done through their Irish subsidiary. The U.S. government counts it as Irish. That's absurd. So you can't use the U.S. government's numbers. They're trying to improve those numbers. They have improved them, but they're still wrong in terms of isolating Chinese investment. Other figures range anywhere from, for 2016, from 45 to ours, which is I think 51 billion now. In all cases, we see Chinese spending in 2016 more than doubling from its previous record, not just from the previous year, but from the previous high. It's not going to be as much this year as in 2016, but it'll still exceed 30 billion probably and still be the second highest on record. So what we had starting in late 2015 was a sea change in the challenge posed by Chinese investment. The fluctuations were driven by the Chinese. First, what you had is a currency mistake made by the People's Bank, which caused a lot of Chinese asset holders to say they didn't want renminbi anymore. You got 10 billion renminbi, which is $1.5 billion or so, and you want to get it out of the country because you don't want to hold renminbi because the People's Bank has undermined the value of the renminbi in August of 2015 and January 2016. You know what? The easiest thing to do is buy property in the United States. Hotels, buildings, whatever, because our property market is enormous. So you can get lost in the shuffle, and you can get a lot of money out that way. And we saw a surge in private Chinese entities buying U.S. property. The single biggest factor in Chinese investment in 2006 was private entities investing in U.S. real estate and tourism. There were others as well, but that was the main quantitative change from 2015 to 2016. And then the Chinese changed the story again because they imposed capital controls, belatedly realizing that they'd screwed up on currency policy. They imposed capital controls in late 2016, which still apply now, which has pulled back Chinese investment flows to the United States and around the world. We've actually been passive to now. I've said this many times at Heritage, and I see my Heritage colleagues in the audience who have said it too. Passive is often the right economic response. Don't just do something, stand there. In Washington, we have members of Congress and various administrations always saying, we need to do something, we need to do something. That's why they were elected to do something. Economically, often the right response is don't do anything. So I'm not criticizing us for being passive to this point, but as Matt alluded to, the Chinese are not going to be passive. The China 2025 document says they want global leadership to the extent that they can get it in IT, robotics, power generation and transmission, biomedicine, new materials, all aspects of transport. They can actually have that one. They're telling us that, that this is going to continue. And, industrial policy, is usually a flop. But that's from the standpoint of the country that thinks it's going to actually achieve all of these wonderful goals. It can harm other countries. No argument there. The biggest critics of U.S. industrial policy do not deny that other people's industrial policy can harm the United States. So just because a policy is unwise and ineffective doesn't mean it doesn't matter. And we know from the Chinese track record that they will acquire by any means necessary advanced technologies in the areas that they're emphasizing. That includes investment. It also includes theft. And in a sort of the amusing link of the two, it includes investment, which puts you in a better position to conduct theft. And that's actually a sort of standard Chinese behavior. Get a stake in a company, have Chinese officials and workers wandering around, and then steal from that company. It started actually with companies conducting joint ventures in China in the 90s, and it's continued to now. So that's the setting of the problem. The right response, in my opinion, as opposed to what's going on Capitol Hill, I didn't give you the sector splits above, when I gave you the totals, because Ingram Micro was an IT wholesaler. That counts as technology. It counts as IT. We don't care. It was a $6 billion sale to the Chinese, and no one should care. It wasn't interrupted by CFIUS, and it shouldn't have been. Whereas the garage stuff that Matt referred to, if you make instead of a $6 billion purchase, you make a dozen $16 million purchases in startups that no one really knows whether technology is working or not, that can be a threat. The $6 billion purchase is not the threat. The big number is not the threat. The threat is, are they actually acquiring technology we don't want them to acquire? The threat is sector specific, and this is where I think the bills kind of fail to come to grips with the real problem. It's not that the Chinese bought a hotel and they might be bugging the hotel. The Chinese bug my office, right? I mean, they don't, who cares? They don't need to own the hotel to bug it. They don't own AEI's building. They don't own Heritage's building. I could tell you stories about the Chinese calling me up at Heritage, like repeating the end of my conversation to me that I just had. So, I mean, that stuff doesn't matter. What matters is they're acquiring advanced technology. And we don't do, that's where the focus should be, and it is behind the scenes at CFIUS, but it's not upfront in U.S. policy. We need to target Chinese entities. Let's not pretend that, Iran is an equivalent investment threat, or Russia is, or that the Chinese, as they sometimes say, think should be treated equally to our NATO allies in terms of their investment rights. That's just ridiculous. If you create a list of national security sectors from the Defense Department, you update it frequently, which is crucial because otherwise it becomes ossified. And you should just ban the Chinese from the investment in these sectors. Straightforward, simple. It's not easy. It's transparent. It doesn't offer judgment calls. It makes the process much easier. And you've solved 90% of the security problem, in my opinion, right there. And then you don't have as much of a difficult trade-off with CFIUS dealing with hard cases and being slowed down and blocking legitimate foreign investment. Just take a bunch of sectors that the Defense Department thinks are crucial, have them updated, and say the Chinese can't acquire here. And all you're doing is tracking Chinese entities, which if I can do it, presumably the U.S. government can do it. This would affect no other major investor, the minor investors that we're essentially enemies with. And it leaves the U.S. open to China for the vast bulk of our economy. So that's my response, which has a snowball's chance of seeing legislation. Current bills, we have the starting problem is Treasury does not want to name specific countries. And this gets back to Matt's point that he was advocating that I disagree with. I see its value, but I don't agree. That they want as much flexibility as possible. They don't want to have direct confrontations with the Chinese over treating China differently. And just, as an instinctive reaction as an economist, tell the damn truth. What are you actually doing? Say what you're actually doing. Like, transparency is a positive. You can clarify the investment process. You can provide assurances to the investors we want in this country, the Japanese, the British, the Dutch, longstanding, the Canadians, longstanding investors, where we say this is not targeted at you. So one point of departure is whether you label the threat. And, I would note that, I don't know where Matt stands on this, but to differentiate our product, Matt starts with China's the threat, and then he wants as much flexibility for CFIUS as possible. I just stick with China's the threat. Let's treat China as it's the threat here. And flexibility for CFIUS is nice, but not if it's going to frighten other investors. We have Grassley-Brown, which is another Senate bill other than the Cornyn bill, also bipartisan, obviously, but not involving Senate leadership. We have various things that Representative DeLauro has introduced on the House side. We have some scattered comments from the administration. If you read a lot of those, and please tell me you don't, because it's not good for your mental health. These tend to veer into outright protectionism. We don't care about the economic benefits of the foreign investment. What we care is that government can take a position which is used to coerce foreign companies and literally, in some cases, benefit our friends, right? Forget what's good for the national interests. We want to have more government intervention in the economy on the investment side, and what's clearly a power grab rather than considering what's best for the country. Those bills are ugly. You can read some of the things Representative DeLauro's office has said. You can read Grassley-Brown. Grassley-Brown's bipartisan. This is not an attack, on Representative DeLauro and saying it's Democrats' fault. There's some just ugly stuff out there. And in comparison, the bipartisan Senate leadership bill, Cornyn's bill, is much better. It's a low bar to clear, but it is much better than that. The bill emphasizes CFIUS funding, which I think we all agree is very important. Congress has a nasty tendency to charge agencies with doing more and then gives them no more resources to do that. It has been pounded home again and again, and I hope Senator Cornyn did it this morning at CSIS. It's certainly being done behind closed doors that you can ask CFIUS to do more if you give CFIUS more with which to do it. And that's a crucial element of the bill, even though it's kind of boring because it's not controversial. The drawbacks of the bill's really long, and it's not just really long. I hated reading it. It's really long, as in the longer legislation is, the more chance that you're gonna get unanticipated consequences. Someone's gonna seize on page 53, paragraph 5, and say, "Aha! This is the guiding principle that we're going to apply. Not this year, not next year, but years from now, when the people directly involved, are no longer in charge, and now we're running off to the races with a process we don't like, or emphasizing factors we don't like." And in particular, and this will be my last point, there's an expansive, unclear definition of national security. I don't want to open if you're a nerd, you know that huge debates over what the definition of national security should be or is, or should we define it and what it means and all that. I don't want to get into that, but it really, there are a lot of things that seem to be critical, and I use that word deliberately, to national security in the bill. The word critical is used a lot. Critical materials, critical technology, critical infrastructure. I don't really think much of U.S. infrastructure is critical. They've done better job on defining it than the original bills, but if you're looking for a reason to be nervous about the Cornyn legislation, which again I think is better than alternative legislation, I do think it's an improvement over the status quo. That's where I'm nervous. That's where I'm trying to get people to recognize, iron ore is not critical. U.S. railways are generally, unless they're engaging in very particular tasks, not critical. And you can slide toward protectionism with national security as an excuse, with too expansive a definition of national security or critical or whatever term you're emphasizing. So on balance, we need to respond to the Chinese. I wish we were more explicit about it. The Cornyn bill does provide CFIUS more resources, which is necessary. I don't see obvious harm in the bill, but I also think that we need to watch out that a bill that is now 80 pages turns into a 120-page bill and becomes a vehicle for protectionism. That's it.
Great, thank you. So a little bit about our organization. The Organization for International Investment started almost 30 years ago. We are an association exclusively comprised of international companies in the United States, about 195 of them. These are companies from all over the world, from all different industries. And we're on a panel talking about national security, but we've got scary companies like Nestle and Michelin and Sony and Bimbo Bakery, which is particularly frightening. So there's an awful lot of global investment in the United States. It doesn't have anything to do with China. We do have, I think, 5 or 6 Chinese-based companies. Happy to tell you them if I can remember them, because these days are quite busy on a lot of the things. But, surprisingly, we didn't start the panel talking about what are the actual benefits of international companies in the United States. Almost 7 million Americans get a paycheck from global companies in the United States, much of it in the manufacturing space. So if we're going to see any resurgence of U.S. manufacturing, it's going to be thanks to global investment in the United States. Reuters did a study which looked at the over 600,000 manufacturing jobs that were created over a 5-year period, and 2/3 of them came from international companies in the United States. These are good paying jobs that are paying on average about 24% higher in compensation than the economy-wide average, about $80,000. About 17% of all research and development in the United States is at international companies. Americans who work at international companies manufacture and produce almost 25% of all U.S. exports. So there's a lot of good things to say about international investment in the United States, and I'm sure my fellow panelists will agree with that. Here's the thing. About 85% of it is due to M&A. So in any economy, the way that a non-homegrown company invests and expands is through mergers and acquisitions. That's not just true in the United States, it's true in lots of places around the world, because if you didn't start here, acquiring an existing business is the fastest way to get access to a market. So the M&A process overall is really important in terms of the overall environment for international investment in the United States. The other thing that M&A does, and foreign investment more broadly, is it brings companies from around the world on the same side of the economic ledger as the United States. And so there's a foreign policy objective within that too. As you get more companies from around the world to buy into the success of the U.S. economy, you can work together on a variety of different policy issues. I agree that CFIUS is right now not funded properly. We have a lot of our companies whose deals are getting delayed and delayed and delayed. They have to spend more money to try to acquire these companies. I know investment bankers who say, I'm going to put all the cross-border deals over here, and we're going to take the domestic-to-domestic ones first, and that's causing disruption. I think a lot of that is due to not only resources, but also and maybe a sense that the Treasury Department, as the chair of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., not sure where to go on it. It can be a scary, I think, position to be in. If anyone was involved in CFIUS during the Dubai ports fiasco, we know what it's like when an administration comes under fire regarding a transaction. But I also think that CFIUS can't be the panacea for espionage, right? And it's 2017, not 1975. And if we just identify threats based on where the ultimate owner sits, we're missing a lot. You know, sometimes the call can come from inside the house. So what I mean about that
Now you're
is,
scaring us.
yeah, what I mean, you know, so when a Chinese insurance company bought the Waldorf Astoria, it went through CFIUS. It went through CFIUS probably for the PR about it to make sure that the deal wasn't sort of thrown under the bus. But the Waldorf Astoria is the home to a lot of important U.S. diplomats when they go to New York. So it's an important facility. But call me crazy, but I want the security of that clean, regardless of whether the Chinese own it, the French own it, the Germans own it, or someone from Oklahoma owns it, right? So we need to do a security sweep of that, regardless of who owns it. You know, right after 9/11, there was a bill that was introduced on Capitol Hill that said no foreign airline could fly over D.C. or New York. It wasn't a foreign airline that was used in the 9/11 tragedy. Also, shortly after 9/11, the Justice Department put together this private sector sort of ready group to sort of like within industries to contact one another if they saw something suspicious. Well, within the oil sector, they didn't include BP, which at the time had the largest oil refinery in the United States. They didn't include Nestle in the water sort of private sector because, you know, they were foreign companies. No one, you know, the F word, if you look it up in the dictionary, it means strange and weird. And so we're compartmentalizing threats based on the ultimate owner. And I think that is very dangerous to do. When my son was just commissioned in the Air Force, and I had a woman come to the house to interview me for his national security clearance or whatever, which is funny given how I know my son. But anyway, that's a separate story. But anyway, she asked me, had he ever worked for a foreign-owned company? And I was like, do you know what I do for a living? So why is that relevant? And I'm sure she was like, oh my goodness, leave me alone. But these sort of constructs that we think about things to make us feel better that, well, it's just the foreigners that want to do us harm, then we can sort of ring fence it and feel better about it. The iPhone is made right down the street from where Huawei is, which our government has declared to be problematic. Why aren't we concerned about what's happening with the iPhone? Just because it's ultimately owned by an American company? So, you know, we are highly supportive of the CFIUS process. We think that as long as it stays very focused on true defense-related national security issues, that it's absolutely important to be in place. We do have concerns about companies trying to use the CFIUS process as a means to scuttle something that they couldn't in the marketplace. And we've seen it done before. We've seen it done we're a Chinese company as well. The concern over China right now is so big that everything related to China is becoming scary. And, you know, I had one of my members, which is a European company, have its deal scuttled, not because it was a German company, but because it had exposure in China. And that company's exposure in China is what brought down the deal. So, you know, all these multinational companies have exposure in China. And I can tell you right now, the environment in the U.S. for international companies is getting worse. We do a CFO survey. CFO survey in 2014, we asked the CFOs, how do you view the U.S. business climate for international companies? 14% said they thought it was getting worse. We just released one. It's now 46% of CFOs say the business climate in the United States is getting worse for international companies. So that's kind of a big deal. It's also a big deal because the U.S. has lost its global share of international investment. In 2000, the U.S. attracted 37% of the world's cross-border investment, and in 2016, we attracted 24%, I think, of cross-border investment. So, we're supportive of the CFIUS process, concerned about it being a protectionist measure, but also believe that it can't be used as cleanly as it might have in the 1980s and the 1990s, because things are not just driven, concerns are not just driven by whether the company is foreign or not, or whether it's Chinese or not. Because you could have somebody who wants to do us harm go to Germany, set up an operation in Germany, and then their investment here. I mean, so just ring fencing certain countries, I think, is absolutely the wrong way to go because of that, because it gives us a false sense of security, and it also can discourage investment here that our governors are in China and around the world beating the bushes to bring to the United States. So it sends a very conflicting message on that front. And I just, on the Cornyn bill, we think that they really tried to take a very thoughtful approach. We appreciate that. And I know that they had a lot of delay in introducing their bill because they were trying to be so thoughtful. And we appreciate that, and we look forward to continuing to work with them. I think we have the same goals. But again, I think that there are other means, whether it be export control or trade policy, looking into supply chains, that we need to think about when protecting our national security, and just focusing on CFIUS, I think, isn't the right answer. So I'll leave it there.
All right, well, we'll open up with Q&A. Raise your hand and please give us your name and affiliation. And of course, make sure to end your sentence with a question. As the moderator, I will take the advantage of that and ask the first question. I was reading through the Cornyn bill, and there's a lot of interesting new ideas. They're small, just kind of reading through it, but I think they have big implications. And two of them are this shift away from focusing on threats specifically toward risk. I don't know if that's a big issue. Maybe leave it up for debate. The other one is the focus on emerging technologies. Should we really care about Chinese investment in companies where we actually don't really know whether these companies might provide some sort of benefit for our U.S. national defense? These companies might not actually exist much longer if it weren't for Chinese investments, perhaps. I'll leave that open to debate. Derek, would you like to take it first?
Sure. Briefly, the risk threat thing, I don't think they were trying to introduce a new idea there. I think there was just a lot of difficulty with the language, which occurred when you take a bill and you're farming it out to lots of different people, and you're trying to get it to be bipartisan. You're trying to get introduction in the House from some people who want a stronger or meaner or whatever, a more interventionist bill. So I don't see that. Of course, I don't know either I think what they were thinking when they wrote it, but after the fact, there could be a different interpretation, and there may be some reason to discuss that. With regard to the emerging technologies, I think that's a really crucial point, meaning that I said this about transport. I don't care if the Chinese want to spend tons of money on transport technology. We have to be really careful that we don't think anything could become crucial to the U.S. and therefore we have to intervene in anything that could become crucial to the U.S. That's the number one approach should not be everything is potentially crucial, therefore there has to be government monitoring. The number one approach should be you need to show me that something is going to become crucial. So there are these jokes like just set up a fake business and Bill Gates will come and pay you off to get out of it. We need to not be going down that road. I would want, in my call for DoD to set up and review a set of sectors that it thinks matter to national security, there would need to be evidence that it matters to national security, not just it's new, we don't know what's going on, we don't know what this firm is actually doing. So I'm with you on that, which is we need to monitor those technologies and those firms, but they shouldn't be subject to national security intervention until DoD has identified a clear reason why they matter and should be protected.
I should just put an accent on that because I think this is the the real nub of the problem is that you know, having been in the CFIUS room a couple of times in my career, you know, and seeing the debate between what I call the Mars agencies and the Venus agencies on these issues, you know, I think there is an important balance here where, you know, where there is a burden on the national security agencies to identify, you know, whether you call it a risk or a threat, and there is a kind of formula for relationship between risk, vulnerability, and threat. But I think that I agree with Derek. I don't think that they were trying to do something new here. But you know, and I think when you see that debate, it's you know, I'd say just I think those perspectives are quite different. There's a sort of, again, I'm oversimplifying, but the Mars agencies tend to see kind of everything as a potential threat, and let's just sort of, you know, shut it down in order to make sure it doesn't become a real problem. The Venus agencies tend to think, you know, what's the problem? You know, everything's fine. You know, let's let this investment. It's going to be good for us. You know, it might save, you know, companies. And I think while you can choose a side there, it's actually healthy to have a debate. I mean, as a citizen thinking about that, I'm actually glad that those perspectives clash and are brought into a private chamber. This is why transparency, yes, in principle, of course, it's hard to argue against transparency, but there is some value in having a kind of a closed space in which, a safe space in which you can have a debate. And in general, in my experience, that, and I think from just the output, looking at, as I say, there haven't been too many mistakes that you've seen. You know, it feels to me like it's working pretty well, that people are having that robust debate, and you're ending up deciding, you know, something here is potentially a real problem. And this highlights something that Nancy said that I just wanted to emphasize as well, which is that, you know, you know, if you just ban stuff, you know, up front, you know, water is going to find its way around the dam. I mean, there's going to be some way that this stuff is going to find its way in here, whether it's through the German example or something else. And so I think it's much better to have a you know, to have a case-by-case look at this particular transaction. Is it, you know, is it problematic, and why? And then you can, and then give, obviously, CFIUS the tools and resources and the analytic capacity to really determine, you know, is this a problem, even though it looks like it's coming from Germany, and that seems to me more powerful and more effective at the end of the day than just sort of having a blanket ban. And then there's one other problem with the blanket ban, in addition to those two, which is that water will find its way around, and that some Chinese investment is actually good for us, and we shouldn't just ban it all, you know, or have the burden or have the presumption that it's bad up front. The third problem is obviously one which I don't think any of us have said, which is that, you know, the bad guys are going to be empowered by whatever we do. So if we ban stuff, they're going to ban stuff, and they're going to probably ban more stuff than we do. I mean, China and Russia and others are going to, frankly, probably France and Italy, Israel and others who are problematic on some of this stuff may feel empowered and emboldened by this. And so I think that's another thing we got to keep in mind here. I like the case by case, but I would say the modification that I'd like to see, in addition to more resources, is maybe a little bit more ability to look at patterns and I mean, explicitly enable CFIUS to look back at other transactions, other patterns. I mean, implicitly, I think they already do that, but to sort of tell them, you know, you got to actually look at these patterns. Is there a sort of sudden rush of stuff from Germany because we've shut off, you know, some of the China doors? And in theory, CFIUS is not supposed to do that. They're supposed to just look at this transaction. But I would say that's something that there would be useful addition to the debate if CFIUS was more empowered to look at patterns and get information from allies and all those good things that are in there.
I would just add, I agree with much of what Mark just said. I absolutely believe that national security is best left undefined. And the case-by-case approach, the sort of hashing it out in a room, I agree with your comments on the need for some opaqueness for that very reason. What worries me right now is I don't know who's in the room anymore on the Venus side. So there's a lot of people on the Mars side right now, which I get and, I completely understand, but it feels a little bit weaker on the Venus side. And in terms of sort of the economics, who is at the table really looking at, just this discussion in and of itself, right? We started out with national security, and I was the cleanup, and the cleanup started with, the economics. And so, no, not disparaging anything, but I think that's sort of the environment we're in because we're scared, right? And I totally get that. But what worries me, just especially with the current environment we're in, that are there enough people there arguing to push back on rather than the knee jerk, well, let's just block it because there could be a national security implication somewhere down the road, or enough people there arguing saying, well, actually, not only about will the foreign investment here benefit the U.S., but how will other countries respond, and the reciprocity angle of it for our companies investing overseas.
Can I just a small two-finger that picks up on your theme of looking at small things that are in here? I think there's one issue about this Venus side of the story which is important, which is Treasury. When I was a whippersnapper at Treasury in the 80s, and was involved in some of this, was a powerful voice in its own right in the CFIUS debate. I think with FINSA, that changed somewhat, and I think this bill seems to, the Cornyn bill, reinforce this trend towards making Treasury more of a secretariat and an honest broker that's sort of the chairman of the process. It's always been that, but it always had its own voice. I feel like that voice has been diminished under FINSA, and again, this bill is moving that further by making it a sort of an uber secretariat for this process. It's a subtle thing, but and I'm not saying I want to tip the balance too much in that direction, because again, I yield to no one. I got kids too. I'm worried about national security, and I'm worried about China. Don't get me wrong when you hear I'm actually, I think there's some things we need to be really worried about here, but I do think we have to be smart about it, and I do think that debate has to be balanced, and there is a risk that Treasury is being pulled a little bit into all the secretariat stuff and not able to really voice. And then you're left with USTR and state and parts of commerce, although commerce has split instincts on some of this stuff. So maybe it's part of justice too, because justice has split instincts too, because they believe in privacy and all that good stuff. So I think. I'm just thinking about the debate in that room. If you take Treasury out of the picture, it will not be as robust a debate, I think. Can I ask you a question, Derek?
Sure.
A genuine question, which is, you mentioned export controls, Nancy. It feels like one of the core things that this bill seems to do is to sort of broaden the definition of a transaction from an M&A, actual acquisition of control, to something else, a broader sort of set of relationships or partnerships, including, just pure licensing of technology. It starts to feel like you're in kind of an export control world rather than a CFIUS world the further you go down that path. Is that a fair point, and should we be looking at our export control regime and saying, how do we toughen that, and why aren't we doing that instead of using CFIUS as the tool to get at some of this stuff?
So that's a good question to ask of me, because it's been raised from the beginning by various people. What we had here was people saying, we have an export control problem, you're not going to solve this through CFIUS. And their response, rather than introducing parallel bills, was to say, well, we're going to solve part of it through CFIUS. We're going to get at some of the export control. I'm not saying they did that. I'm saying that was their response. They chose not to say, let's have two pieces of legislation and export control legislation. There are other pieces of legislation as well that we could imagine, but just let's pick those two. We're going to have CFIUS legislation and we're going to have export control legislation. They decided we're just going to push some of the export control work into CFIUS. I don't think that's the ideal response. I agree with people who say I'd really like to see explicit export control legislation to do the things that we mean, and have CFIUS do what it's supposed to do, which is stick to investment review. But if you are not going to introduce that legislation, and having seen how difficult it was to shepherd this legislation to the point that it's at, where even as recently as 3 weeks ago, I was saying you can't bring that up. The draft that they had 3 weeks ago, I said that has to stop. You have to change it. I don't know why they did, but somebody got to them. So we've had a lot of difficulty getting this bill forward, and I think the ideal solution is two separate bills dealing with two separate topics, and it is a harm to dump extra stuff on CFIUS like this. But if our choice is just this bill with no export control legislation on the horizon anywhere, I'd rather have this. So, I hate being in the wimpy compromise position, but I think I don't want to put words in either of your mouths, but I think both my fellow panelists have talked about there are other issues outside of CFIUS. Right now, we don't have any other means to address them other than this bill. It would be great if there was an export control bill that we all looked at and said, hey, this has got some promise. Then we wouldn't have to deal with this in context of CFIUS legislation. But there's nothing like that on the horizon. And I really think when I say nothing on the horizon, I mean like 4 years to come.
I'm David Kreutzer with the Heritage Foundation. Derek, you have saved me in the past from worrying about China when I was worried, and so now I'm giving you the opposite job. I take no small comfort in the fact that China's plan for world domination involves a plan, and the plan involves more party control. So why is it I need to worry about them taking over stuff?
I don't think you need to worry about China taking over the world economically at all. I'm about to release a paper saying, the most likely outcome for the Chinese is that in 10 years we'll all say, why was anyone worried about China economically? They're well down that path. It's a path I argued when I was here at Heritage. But getting back to the industrial policy usually doesn't work, but it can still hurt you argument. Just on the econ side, I have all these national security people telling me that AI, artificial intelligence, is going to transform national security. I have no way to evaluate that. But if to the extent that they're right, that's a national security threat. On the econ side, if AI really does have all these uses, other than driving cars that then get hit by human drivers, which has already happened, it does have all these uses. The Chinese are gonna try to steal that industry, and they're gonna steal it by legitimate means, like in regular economic competition, and they will be happy to resort to illegitimate means. And I agree with my fellow panelists that CFIUS can't and shouldn't try to address all those threats, but I don't think that means you shouldn't try to address the threat that you can address with CFIUS legislation. So I don't think China's going to take over the world. I don't think it's going to take over all these industries that it's targeting. It's already having problems. There have been small tweaks in the original list as they go, that's not quite going to work, and they start talking about the industries that they want to lead in differently. But they can do a lot of harm to the U.S., both commercially and potentially on the national security side, while they're not taking over the world. And they will succeed in some areas. And the question is whether we want to have that success occur without some sort of U.S. response. And if it were just in the fact of China investing cleverly at home and making acquisitions here that are legitimate acquisitions, we'd say yes. But that's not the Chinese track record. Chinese telecom is built on theft. That's why there's also great companies. There's also a huge market. There's also innovation, but it got jump-started by theft from us and the Canadians mostly. Their transport got jump-started by theft from the Japanese and the Germans. So if you think that Chinese telecom is now a factor that has hurt some U.S. telecom companies and maybe the U.S. economy, maybe. If you think that Chinese transport is now a factor that has hurt some of our allied economies, you should be aware that they can do that again. They're not going to take over the world, but there may be another sector that we look at in 10 years and say the Chinese stole the founding technology of this. They protected their own market, which is something that Matt was talking about right at the beginning, and now they lead in this industry where we could be employing 250,000 more Americans at good wages if we didn't have to deal with illegitimate Chinese practices.
I wanted to get back at this issue of reciprocity. It's something we've, heard anything from the current administration to just the ongoing CFIUS debate with emerging bills and people talking about how other countries would, of course, institute their own CFIUS reciprocity depending on either the sector or the threats that, or just for whatever reason, kind of reciprocate increasing costs for companies looking to invest abroad. How would that balance? How might this balance, though, with the increasing calls for international cooperation? Derek, I know you've talked about this. I've talked about this. It talks a little bit about it in the Corn Bill, working with countries like Japan, their FEFTA, CFIUS legislation. European countries, not necessarily the EU, but specific European countries, working with them to sort of collaborate. Do you maybe like I'm thinking perhaps in the long run a divide between the commercial economies versus the social economies and reviewing investments. What do you think?
Which side of the Europeans on?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Matt, would you like to start?
Well, I mean, there are a couple things in there. I mean, first of all, on reciprocity, let me tell you something that I didn't say strongly enough, and I do say normally when I talk about this, which is, I think Derek did say it, about keeping the economic benefit stuff out of CFIUS. I think, again, going back to the thinking about those debates in that room, it's already hard enough to have this debate about national security and defining what that is and, what we're going to do about it. If you added in that mix, is this provide economic benefit or not, it would just make that conversation much more challenging. And I think it would be a slippery slope to all kinds of people coming and, proposing things that were really not about either national security or real economic competitiveness. They were just, I don't want this foreigner, in my market and taken away from my market share. And so I definitely think CFIUS should stay away. And to the credit of the Cornyn bill, it very clearly says, we're not gonna put the economic benefit in here. Now, as to whether, having dismissed that, whether we do have a need to try to use something like reciprocity to solve the problems that I identified in the beginning of my talk about the problems in the Chinese market. I think I often sort of use my hands to show, yes, but let's be careful. I mean, if we're this open and China's this open, okay, the goal is to get China to be as open as we are, not to bring us down to their level. We don't want them to set the terms of, what sort of an open economy is or what an efficient economy is. It wouldn't be an efficient economy.
Or globalization, which they're actually trying to set the terms of.
Right. Well, they say right, but down at this level, we don't want to pull them down. Now, so then that leaves you, okay, but if they are down here and we're up here, do we have to threaten to go down, to their level in order to push them up that level? Well, maybe, but I think you just need to keep in your mind that there are some hazards in using a reciprocity approach, that we just want to be sure we're not following them down the path to perdition. And so that's, I guess, the other broad point. And then on allies, absolutely, I think we need to be coordinating with them. Again, I think that the Germans, the Europeans would not have understood our interest in that conversation 2 years ago. Right. I mean, literally, I was in Europe 2 years ago, and people, what's the problem? We're buying lots of our stuff, and it's all a very happy story. And then something changed about 2 years ago with this KUKA deal, with other things where the scales fell from their eyes. And now you've got the Germans and the French and the Italians going to Brussels and saying, we need some kind of European mechanism to screen investment because this is a real problem for us. And so I think they're much more amenable, but they're not quite there yet, and their systems are not as robust. Japan, you mentioned their FEFTA law, which is better. They've improved it, but it's not. It's really run by the finance ministry, and the finance ministry over there doesn't have the same, to the credit of this Treasury, the same national security kind of mentality at all. They just, they don't really think that way. So there's a lot of work to be done, and that's one of the reasons for allied coordination, I think, is to try to get them to a higher standard of, but one that's principles based and basically again, maintains open markets, but with a rifle shot approach to protecting national security.
Nancy, I can imagine that international companies would like to see some sort of continuity between these review mechanisms. I mean, what do you think? How might international cooperation on this issue kind of help facilitate investment?
Well, I do think that, the U.S. is definitely ends up paving the way. And so if we tighten our markets, we certainly would expect others to tighten theirs. And we already see it happening as the U.S. has started, blocking some transactions and other things that I think are giving a signal that we're sort of pulling back from as open economy as we've been before, and the extent to which whether the president prefers bilateral cooperation or multilateral cooperation, I'm not sure, but I do think that it can be helpful because, as we all know, you can go down this very slippery slope of, well, who can protect themselves more, and the U.S. has kind of already gone that direction. So I think it definitely, reciprocity can mean one thing to one person, another thing to another person, and if you put that, was much appreciated that I understand from the get-go the Cornyn folks were considering some reciprocity things which sound absolutely fair, but as you tease it out, understand that it really can be manipulated in a way that's not beneficial for our interests.
Less than a minute. Congress cannot lead international cooperation on this. The Cornyn bill can call for it. It can't do anything. This has to be the administration. And if you had someone, preferably a Treasury, it doesn't have to be a Treasury, but that's the obvious place for it, who would really go to the Australians who are in soul dividing debates over the Chinese role in the Australian economy, and unfortunately, to some extent, in the Australian political system. They have the Foreign Investment Review Board. They have an established procedure which isn't ours. What can we learn from them? What can they learn from us? The Japanese, of course, are very interested. People have talked about Europeans. We need to talk to the Israelis. The Israelis are selling the Chinese some technology I wish they would not sell. So there are a lot of people that we should coordinate with, where we can improve our own process. We can standardize it. We can give multinationals an environment that has some regularity to it. But it's not going to be done by Congress. This has to be done by the administration. And unfortunately, I don't see any such person. I'm not saying the administration has to make what we're talking about here their top priority, and that's excessive. But I'd like to see somebody emerge in the administration, preferably a Treasury next year. Then the U.S., I think, can do the job that we all want to do, a proper job of coordination. Congress cannot do that. It cannot be in the finding sections of a congressional bill. It has to be carried out by the administration. So we should cooperate. We all say that. People in the administration say it. That's all very nice. Someone has to carry the water, and we don't have that person.
Let's make this the last question, and then we can do perhaps a 1-minute wrap-up each.
Thanks. South China Morning Post, Lu Zhenhua. I have two questions. One is about what exactly additional resources that Cornyn bill could give the CFIUS process. If we take a case-by-case approach, we can see that the Lattice case is already blocked, and there is dispute about the national security implication of this specific case. So if there is no Cornyn bill and Lattice case will block it as well. So what the specific sectors in this bill that could the U.S. could pay attention to those Chinese investment. And second question is Matthew, you mentioned that the Treasury used to have a strong voice in the process. Do you mean that Treasury used to be in favor of foreign investment and can direct the process to favoring foreign investment to U.S. and if there is Cornyn bill in place, what the process can be changed into what form? Thanks.
You want to do the first one?
Yeah, the Cornyn bill does not specify sectors. I'm the one who wanted to do that. The Cornyn bill just talks about things being critical. That makes me nervous because I don't know what the definition of critical is, and they apply critical to a lot of nouns, and I think that's too expansive. So the Cornyn bill doesn't advance us on that in terms of it doesn't inform investors very well. They're still faced with a maybe, if you want to say the positive side, a flexible set of CFIUS criteria, on the negative side, an opaque set of CFIUS criteria. With regard to whether the Cornyn bill would have made any difference with Lattice, no, it wouldn't have. Lattice still would have been rejected. We could go back further, and Huawei, various Huawei attempts would have also been rejected, were rejected without Cornyn and would be rejected with this bill. I'll say that it doesn't say this in the Cornyn Bill because it seems obvious, but it's not obvious in the behavior of some Chinese companies. The Lattice deal was doomed as soon as Canyon Bridge tried to pretend it was an American company at the beginning. Huawei got in trouble because they didn't disclose what they were doing. So Chinese companies that start off on the wrong foot, that make a mistake with regard to disclosure to the to CFIUS or other elements of the U.S. government or even state government, there's a prejudice against them that carries through. Like, why didn't you tell us the truth at the beginning? And so the implication I have for that is I really want clarity in U.S. regulations because it's not obvious to foreigners when they come here what they're supposed to do. Now, in Huawei's case, I just consider them to be a dishonest company. I've had too many American representatives of Huawei sit next to me on panels and say things that aren't true. But I think with new Chinese companies, for example, possibly Canyon Bridge, they just don't know. They're being told by some American advisor, this is what you're supposed to do. So the clarity of regulations, what I'm hoping for out of this legislative process is not that we're going to like start allowing Chinese transactions that we didn't allow before. That's not going to happen, as colleagues have talked about. The risk is in the other direction, but that we're telling Chinese investors and other investors up front, you know, this is the process you need to follow, and it's clear to them where this is going to be a questionable investment. This is not going to be a questionable investment. This is what you need to do step one. This is what you need to do step two. So, that gets back to my concern with the Cornyn Bill. I have trouble understanding all of it. And I've read every draft for the last 18 months. So I think that's the weakness on the Cornyn side, not that it's going to block new Chinese transactions that weren't going to be blocked anyway. They were going to be blocked anyway, as you said. But I want us to have a transparent environment for investors so that they know that 95% of their investments are going to go through fine, and here are the troublesome ones. I don't think the Cornyn Bill establishes that, unfortunately.
Just very quickly on the Treasury thing. No, what I meant was that Treasury still is one of the, whatever it is, 12 agencies that sits around the table, and they're allowed to give their view, and their view is basically that an open investment climate is good for the United States for growth and jobs as their kind of default position. But they are a national security agency, and so where there is a national security threat, they will support, targeted action, mitigation, or blocking of an agreement. And my only point was, if you've ever chaired a meeting, you know that you have a responsibility to make sure that everybody's voice is heard, that you're being fair and balanced, and it becomes harder if you're that same person to also say, well, okay, now I'm taking off my chairman's hat, and here's what I really think. I think this is a bunch of bullshit, and it's very hard for a chairman to do that. And all I mean is at the margin, I think it's maybe a bit harder for Treasury to express its view, and that does get the sort of the balance and the force a little bit. What is the Star Wars thing? The balance and the force.
Nice.
But that's a marginal thing. I mean, Treasury's still a voice, if that's what you're worried about. Treasury's still a voice for an open U.S. economy, basically, except where there's a national security threat.
So why don't we just go down real quick and just 30 seconds to a minute, takeaways. What can we take away from today, really?
I'm
you want to start first?
No,
Okay.
so give her the last word.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
You want?
Right.
You can have the last word. You go
So
first.
I had less than 30 seconds, which is, I think the Cornyn Bill is an improvement over the status quo. If someone shows me other things that we could do, I would be happy to say, all right, let's not pass the Cornyn Bill, or let's pass it in association with other legislation. I'm not seeing initiatives from the administration on this score. This was very difficult to get this bill forward, and I don't know of any other legislation in Congress. So I think criticisms of U.S. policy are warranted, but as a practical matter, it's this versus things that are worse. And so that's in the sense that right now I think the Cornyn Bill is a positive in this current environment.
I guess my 30 seconds would be: look, we have a problem. We have a China challenge that has many dimensions, and I think we need to be much more, aware of that, vigilant, and doing the 4 sets of things that I mentioned, and this is one of them. I just want to be sure that we are, you know, where we see a nail sticking up, that we're using a hammer to hit it down, not a sledgehammer or you know, something. And I feel that the Cornyn bill, while well-intentioned, as I say, I like the preamble. If you read the preamble of this would take you 30 seconds to read it. It's actually all good stuff, and it's identifying both the importance of an open investment climate, but also the specific national security challenges, and is trying to address that. I just think it may go a little far.
Yeah, I like the preamble as well. We helped work on the preamble. So I would just add that I think that there definitely are some real concerns out there. We do think that this process is always best done with careful changes because of all that hangs in the balance, not only here in the U.S. but around the world. And policy, you know, sometimes, but if there's not enough time to thoughtfully consider policy, there can be an enormous amount of unintended consequences. We saw after Dubai ports, all the legislation that was introduced at the time was problematic, and it wasn't until we had gotten a few years away from sort of the big crisis there that we were able to pass what felt like more thoughtful legislation than some other things that were introduced. You know, I think that Senator Cornyn and his colleagues have put something thoughtful forward, and we look forward to working with them in areas to ensure that we flag the unintended consequences, but that we can't just, the final point I'll just make is that we can't just look at concerns based on, you know, 1970, 1980 constructs of how we used to think about things, whether something is Chinese owned or UK owned, or it's not the ownership anymore. Sometimes ownerships can be very complicated, sometimes for tax purposes and other things, to Derek's point about a Chinese company being an Irish firm. And so if we think about it by those ownerships rather than what are the critical technologies regardless of who owns it, and let's make sure they go through careful review, I think that we could be lulling ourselves into a false sense of security on some of it.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists today.
Overwhelming applause. Deafening.